Also, another member now, permanent member, at least until it's done, of our committee is our architect. And he is here today. I'm going to let him kind of introduce himself. And he's with us today just to kind of say hello. And so I'll tell you, we went through kind of a process of selecting an architect. We looked at a lot of pictures and websites and things like that and narrowed that down to three. And had three to come and give us presentations, kind of like an interview, so we could ask them questions, they could show us their work, that kind of thing. And all three were very good, I must say that, as far as the quality of their work and the things that they've done, their work history. But one of the things that we learned is that it's not always just about the quality of work, it's also if you think that that architect is going to be a good match for this parish. And so that's how we landed on Envios Architecture. And the lead architect that's working with us is Michael Egan. So would you come on and say hello, Michael?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. So a little bit about Envios Architects. I guess first of all, we're grateful, as Father was mentioning earlier, of being selected to work with Immaculate Parish. We've been in business since 1999, and I was in business before that with another company for 17 years. So I've been focusing on faith-based work my whole career. In particular, the last 20 years as Envios Architects. We're a small architectural practice out of Indianapolis. There's 6 of us. 3 of us licensed architects and 3 graduate architects. Our mission, as you see behind us, is to lead, create, and inspire places of Catholic worship. Places of worship. Most of our work tends to be Catholic. I'm Catholic, or you wouldn't hire me probably. My partner is Lutheran, and that always makes for good discussion in our office, you know. Find out what we're doing wrong as Catholics. Our work, we do work all over the state of Indiana. We work for the Diocese of Erie, Diocese of Lafayette, Archdiocese of Indianapolis, Archdiocese of Cincinnati, Diocese of Evansville, Diocese of Owensboro now. Believe it or not, we work for the Diocese of Dallas. We designed a chair for a presider's chair for a congregation there. Some of our work, which you see up here, I'll go from your left to right. The left-hand most picture is St. Malachy, which is a brand new church, or at least in 2008 was brand new at the time. In Brownsburg, Indiana. It's the largest Catholic church in the state, in the Archdiocese, 1,500 seats. So it was all brand new, okay? The one next to it is St. Mary's in Greensburg, Indiana. Seats about 800, expandable to 1,200 in the future. The one in the center is St. Benedict Cathedral in Evansville, which will be dedicated on Wednesday. So if you're not doing anything on Wednesday, about midday, come on over. The one next to it is St. John the Baptist in Newburgh, Indiana. And on the far right is Sacred Heart of Jesus Catholic Church in Indianapolis. It was destroyed by fire. It was a pre-Vatican II church, and we kind of put it back together. So I show you all of those, one, to give you confidence that we've got experience in working with all different sorts of architecture and many different congregations, okay? And our solutions are really come from you all. I don't think you'll find a pattern up there. I hope you don't. I don't think you will. They're unique to each congregation. And we'll work hard to listen and solve your needs. And yeah, so that's pretty much us. So I think with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brother Martin and go from there.
Thank you for coming back, or welcome to the new people. Last time we were together, I think about the place we ended was with the house churches that were beginning to spread around the Mediterranean area. So you have the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then for about the first 200 or 300 years, the Christian community is basically meeting in borrowed spaces. Apartment houses, houses that are donated by other members of the community to use for worship. Gradually, these were modified. Sometimes, such as in Rome, an apartment building would be purchased, more like a condo, I suppose. And when the building or the condo next to it became available, they'd buy that one also and then knock out the walls between them so that they could have a bigger hall or aula for Eucharistic worship. So we're going to start with the beginning of the Roman influence in the church. Just before 313, there was sort of a civil war going on in Rome, and Constantine was one of the contenders, and his rival was a general named Maxentius. And the night before the big battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a dream during which he was told that if he put this sign, the Cairo, on his standards, he would conquer. And he did conquer. And so as part of that, what followed, he published the Edict of Milan, which basically allowed for the first time Christians to come, in a sense, above ground and worship in public. Right? Now, one of the things that became a question for all these Christian communities is, what kind of building do we want? Because up till now, we've just been using borrowed kinds of spaces. So they did decide on one type of building called a basilica, which you've probably heard that name. There are certain churches designated as basilicas, but the basilica, in essence, is a Roman courthouse or a Roman place of government. One of the interesting things that Constantine does is at the place in Rome where Maxentius had all of his troops quartered, Constantine levels all of his rivals' camp, in a sense, and he builds on that site St. John Lateran, the Cathedral Church of Rome, so that no matter what, Maxentius was not coming back. So, this is looking at the floor plan of a basilica, and you may recognize at least part of this floor plan because it is in essence still pretty much what's used today in terms of floor plan of churches up until contemporary times. You have a long rectangular space. Sometimes it has a colonnade or ambulatory that circles around the perimeter. And at one end, or in the case of the ancient basilicas, at two ends there was a kind of a half dome called an apse. All right? So the ritual action for the government, whether they were some sort of processions or parades or debates or whatever took place here, and the seat of the emperor or the judge or the governor was in this half-round apse area. This is a kind of a three-dimensional view of if you were in a basilica looking toward the other end. So there were vast spaces in some senses. So now the government house actually becomes the house for the church. The altar is placed in the center of this large open area in the rectangle. The ambulatories in some places are retained. In other places, they just built them without ambulatories. And the chair of the governor or the emperor or the judge now becomes the place where the priest or the bishop sits. This is a 4th century basilica in Trier, Germany. It is a church, but it is no longer a Catholic church. It is a evangelical Lutheran church. After World War II, the government of Germany got all of the historic buildings together and divided them between all of the major denominations, so that all the good stuff didn't go to one denomination. So this is an evangelical Lutheran church, and when you see the interior, you see what kind of a big open wide space it is. So it is not a small, tiny, intimate space. The church also begins to adopt some of the customs of the Roman court and the Roman government. So in one sense, you can say that the history of where the altar is placed in the church is also kind of a slow but steady migration away from the center toward one end where the presbytery or that apse is. Ministries, as they become more formulated and stratified and formalized, the space is adjusted to accommodate those changes. So, on the left-hand side, you see where the altar would be placed, sort of at the beginning of the use of these basilica churches. Sometimes the altar was raised up on a step, but there was another little enclosure that was open at both ends that allowed processions to go in and out and back and forth. And this became the place not only for the ambo, the place where the scriptures were read, they were usually elevated, but it also became the place where the choir stood. Okay. Slowly over time, the altar moved to the other side of that area and was up here near the seats where the presiders were. So some of the other things, the church began to adapt or adopt some of the customs and etiquette of the Roman court. So, for example, the dalmatic, the garment worn by the deacon, even to this day, is actually a court officials would wear this type of a garment with the sleeves on it, like the deacons do. Vessels became more elaborate. This mosaic, which is in Ravenna, one of the seats of Roman government at a certain period in the 7th or 8th century, has a picture of Justinian, the emperor, surrounded by his court. So on one side are the military officials, on the other side are the church officials. So you have the bishop, priest, and a couple of deacons. Last time we were together, we looked at a mosaic that actually came from the apse of this church. This is San Clemente in Rome. And so you can see how the altar by this time has moved into the apse. And if you recall that mosaic up above that had the tendrils with the spirals, that's on the ceiling up here. But you notice that there is this wall that surrounds kind of an empty space in the middle. There's still an ambulatory around the edge, so you have that colonnade that defines that inner space. But this short wall that would remind us, I think, of something like a communion rail, has these open spaces so that processions again could move from one end of the church to the other, from the altar and back out again. And then the ambo was raised up almost on the wall, so when the reader read, at this time it was he, the reader would be above the level of the people, so the voice would project. Gregory the Great becomes Pope in Rome, and he does a little work on St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's, became kind of the mother church of all of the Catholic world because it was at the center of Vatican City. And it's the Pope's church, but it's not the Cathedral of Rome, that's St. John Lateran. But one of the things he does is he puts the altar directly above the spot where, by custom, it was said that Peter's tomb was located. Right? So not only does he locate the altar directly above the belief at that time that that's where Peter's tomb was, but he raises it up so that you can go underneath the altar into a subterranean chamber and come closer to the relics of Peter. So the altar is pulled back even farther and raised up from the level of the congregation. This would be a floor plan of St. Peter's, at the early St. Peter's. And you notice a couple things. In the middle of this sort of open atrium, which is also very much like the atrium, but on a much smaller scale in these Mediterranean homes, there is a fountain. So that image that carried over from the Mediterranean home is still active in this church. And then it retains that basilica shape, the colonnade, the rectangle, there's an apse at one end. But then you have these kind of protrusions from the side that make the church almost cruciform in shape. This is not St. Peter's, of course, but it is one of these early Roman basilicas, basilica churches. And what you can see, it's Santa Sabina in Rome. And I think it's all decked out for a marriage service. But you can see there are steps going up to the altar, which are about 7 or 8 feet here. And then there are steps going down into the martyrium on either side of the main platform. Have any of you ever visited Rome? Have any of you ever visited what's called the Scavi? Scavi? Good. The Scavi is actually an excavation underneath the Church of St. Peter in Rome. When Peter was martyred in what was called a circus, or like an amphitheater, he was buried in a close by cemetery, which is a public cemetery. When Constantine became the emperor, he wanted to build a church over the place where Peter was buried. Unfortunately, that cemetery was on a hillside. So he brought in millions of tons of earth and leveled out kind of a plateau above where that cemetery was. And by historic custom, the first St. Peter's was said to have the altar right above where Peter was buried. No one knew this for sure, although that still was the story, until about the 1930s. The Pope commissioned an archaeological excavation beneath St. Peter's, and they dug down to the level, and you go through all these different levels. But they finally reached that cemetery, which used to be open to the sky. It would be like going to a public cemetery here and being able to walk down the pathways. Now, however, it's all covered, with vaulting, so the ceiling stays up. But it is still open for people to visit. And if you go to St. Peter's and to the left side of the entrance of the church, there is a little gatehouse with a Swiss guard standing there. And if you tell him, I want to go to the Scavi office, they let you through. And you book a ticket, which you don't have to pay for. You book a ticket to go visit the Scavi. So you get there at the appointed time, and there's 3 people that meet you, an archaeologist and 2 guards. So they tell you, you may not touch anything once you go through the airlocks. You may not leave anything behind, you may not pick anything up. But as soon as you go through these 3 airlocks, you are basically walking on the pathways of this ancient Roman cemetery, just like the ancient Romans did. And they knew, as the archaeologists kept digging and digging and digging, that they were getting close to the area where Peter was buried, because there were inscriptions in all of the mausoleums or some of the graves that said, Marcus Patelus, close to Peter, right? Or Flavia, close to Peter. And finally, they got a few that were, somebody's name next to Peter. And they finally found a little tomb. To us, it looks like kind of a low, almost like a doghouse kind of a shape. And it had holes in the side where you could stick your hand through the holes and touch the bones of Peter. So this cemetery is in perfect condition. All of the fresco paintings in the mausoleums and mosaics that are on the sides of the buildings are all still intact. And if you ever have the chance to see that, you should go, because it's well worth the experience. It's probably one of the best things I've ever seen in Rome. So, as time goes on, and this kind of reconfiguration of the interior space continues, the community is separated by sex on different sides of the church. So men on one side, women on the other side, and a low wall delineates the edge of the sanctuary from where the congregation stands. And after about the 7th or 8th century, women are no longer allowed in the sanctuary. This is Santa Maria in Cosmedin, another small church in Rome, but it has all of these elements present in it. So again, you get this wall that separates sanctuary from the congregational space. You still have this space that protrudes for the scola, which is the choir, and that doorway which opens between them, but now there are women on one side and men on the other. One of the few exceptions to this form of Basilica Church is in the city of Aachen in Germany, where Charlemagne kind of refounded the Roman Empire, and he built this octagonal-shaped church for himself, and it was called the Palatine Chapel. So it was not something that was open to people to come into and worship there. It was for his use all by himself. He sat on the second floor in his throne and looked at all the action on the floor beneath him. One of the wonderful things in this, he gave the chandelier which lights the church, which is a symbolic representation of the heavenly Jerusalem and its gates. So that hangs right in the middle of the church. And just to show you that no idea is totally ever lost, this is church in Cologne, Germany. And the baldacchino, or canopy over the altar, mimics that same idea of the heavenly Jerusalem. And it also mimics another idea. As the baldacchino comes down to that point that hovers above the altar, you see there's a golden dove there, right? And clutched in the dove's claws is it's kind of a lozenge-shaped box that's covered with laurel decoration, laurel leaves, which would be a victor's crown. That's the tabernacle. All right? It takes a reference from the very earliest form of tabernacles that were displayed in churches, and those were very small, almost true-to-life shaped, golden or enameled doves that hung from the ceiling, suspended above the altar. We'll look at some of those next time. The other form of architecture that was taken from Rome was the baptistry. All right, and this plays into some of those shapes that we were looking at last time of square, hexagon, octagon, and the dome shape. So the earliest kind of mausoleum form, this is the tomb of Hadrian in Rome, which is now Castle San Angelo, that was turned into a castle by some of the medieval popes. So when the popes were being attacked in Rome, they would hustle down the street and hide themselves here. This is the baptistry for St. John Lateran. And we're going to kind of zip through a couple of these. So a cutaway view shows the octagonal building. It has an ambulatory, and then in the center of it, there is the baptismal font, the baptismal pool. A little floor plan. This is actually what the original baptismal font looks like in that baptistry. Baptistries are the place where baptism was celebrated. It was always separate from the rest of the church because people were baptized without clothing. And so it was not considered to be a public event. But the baptistry was historically located near the entrance to the church because the way churches are laid out is as if they are a roadmap for your life as a Christian. So you begin your life with Christ in the waters of baptism, and only after you go through the waters of baptism do you end up at the altar. Right? And usually the pathway through the baptismal font went something like this. You entered on one side of the baptismal font and went down 3 steps into the water pool. And then on the opposite side of the baptismal font, you went up 3 steps, and then you continued down the aisle of the church, or into the next room outside of the chapel. This was done for several reasons. You are baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, so each one of these steps represents one of the Trinity. And the reason you don't come out of the font on the same side you go in is because St. Paul tells us in his writings, when you go down into the waters, you die and rise with Christ. It is a life-changing choice, and so you never turn around and go back the way you came. So a couple early fonts. This is in Tours underneath the cathedral, what's now the cathedral. Some of these shapes we looked at, octagons and circles and crosses and squares, are all, you can find them all in these early baptismal chapels. A cross-shaped font in the middle of a circular chapel. This is kind of interesting. It's a rectangular font with a shape in the middle where you would stand, and then 3 steps going up, 3 steps going down. This lobed octagon, in a sense, made of brick and then covered probably at the time with plaster or stone. The rendering, archaeologists think it looked like this when it was new. So you walked up 3 steps into the pool. There were curtains that could be kind of pulled shut during the baptism, and then you walked out the other side into the next part of the church. We're zooming along here, probably going like 700 years or several hundred years of a slide. But around the year 580, one of the things that began to happen in Europe was the rise of monasticism. There had been monks and nuns in the Christian church since the 300s, and most of them were living in the Egyptian desert. But around 580, Benedict, who was kind of a minor Roman nobility figure, decided to become a hermit. And he withdrew to the forest. And gradually people who heard about him came and said, "We want you to teach us about the way you live." And so one of the first communities of monks was founded. And eventually he wrote a rule for monks, which is the rule that we still follow today. So it has endured for over 1,500 years. Now, I have to say that the first group that said, come on and be our abbot, our leader, after they actually had Benedict as their leader, they thought he was a little too strict, so they tried to poison him. It's a good Italian custom. He was in the custom. There is a certain iconography surrounding Benedict, and on the front of our church there is a statue of Benedict holding a chalice, and there's a snake coming out of the chalice. And the chalice is broken. So the custom is that he had a habit of making the sign of the cross over his food and drink. And when he made the sign of the cross over the chalice, it fractured. So the kind of symbol that's associated with Saint Benedict is always this cup with a snake coming out of it. He moved on, founded another community, and that one lasted. This icon, which represents kind of the danger of monastic life, is called the Ladder of Monks. I have a copy of this hanging over my bed. And it represents that even though you are a monk, it doesn't mean you have an easy ride to get yourself to heaven. So the people are climbing this ladder, and as they're climbing, demons are shooting arrows or spears at them, or hooking them and pulling them off the ladder. So you have to keep constantly focused on Christ. So this is the floor plan of the monastic church of St. Gallen. So you see that Roman basilica shape, that long hall, and the apse at both ends. But what has happened to the inside? All throughout the church now there are many, many small altars. There are towers on the outside. So one of the things that began to evolve after monasteries arose, and they arose in all places in Europe very quickly, is people would come to the monasteries and say, I will endow the monastery with land or with a gift of, say, like, I'll give you you have the rights to take all of the fish out of this river from now and until eternity, if you promise to pray for my dead father. So as a result of some of these desires for monks to pray for the dead, more and more of the monks had to be ordained priests because they needed more and more altars to accommodate all these people that needed to say Mass. And so you ended up having multiple altars in the church. This, by the way, is an ideal plan. There was such a place called St. Gallen, a very famous, it had the most famous library in all of Europe. And in the 17th century, the abbot of St. Gallen, as well as the abbot of the monastery that founded St. Meinrad, were also princes. So they were the secular ruler, but they were also the church ruler at the same time. So the government of Switzerland told them, you can keep your monastery and keep your abbot title if you renounce the title of prince. But if you want to keep your title as prince, we're going to shut down the monastery. So the abbot of St. Gallen tested them, and the government closed down the monastery and took the library, which is now the public library of St. Gallen, the canton in Switzerland. So that space for cantors, which was that low wall, becomes quite a bit lengthened because now there are lots of monks, nuns, or canons whose main job is to chant the office 6 or 7 times a day. They become, in a sense, the professional choir. Customs, we talked about, to offer masses for the dead. The more that multiplied, the more altars were needed. Also, in churches that had many visitors or pilgrims, in order not to disturb the liturgy that was going on in the sanctuary, that kind of, waist-size railing that divided the sanctuary from the rest of the church now became a wall that was so tall you couldn't see past it into the sanctuary. That was called a rood screen, not rood like R-U-D-E, but R-O-O-D, which means the cross. So there's an expression that even when I was a kid, people would say, "I'm going to church to hear the Mass." In medieval times, that's really what you did. You heard the Mass because actually all of it was going on behind the wall that you couldn't see through. So that gave rise to several other things that were happening around this time. There was a great, and this is a rood screen that still exists. I mean, they were beautiful, they were covered with beautiful sculpture. This one in Germany has stucco images, three-dimensional images of the 12 apostles. And the only way into the sanctuary was through the door, which usually was closed while Mass was going on. These screens, by the way, did not come down until the Reformation. On top of these large screens, which you couldn't see above, usually was placed a crucifix, sometime that scene of John and Mary at either side of the cross. This one has two angels. This is in the Cathedral Church of Halberstadt in Germany. It's like a historic jewel. It looked like somebody closed the door in 1300 and never went back. So it's a great place to go. Monastic churches continued to develop, and along with the development of monastic churches came the rise of pilgrimage and the veneration of relics. And so this is the Abbey Church of Conques in south central France, which is way up in the mountains. Benedictine monasteries always chose high places. Very often they were surrounded by city walls, almost like castle walls to protect. The idea being that everything you needed to live was inside this wall. And the rule of St. Benedict actually says, unless there's really a very, very good reason, no one should leave the monastic enclosure. And if you do, you are not allowed to talk about it once you come back into the monastery. So this is the interior of the Abbey Church of Conques. Part of this architecture, which is Romanesque, is characterized by this rounded Roman arch, very heavy, thick walls. When you look at the height of this space, you notice that the windows are very small. That's because the walls had to be so thick to support the ceiling, which was barrel vaulted. So kind of a arched kind of vaulting. Floor plan of Conques. So you come in the main doorway, and there is this ambulatory that you can go into. And around this ambulatory now are developing these, what they call radial chapels. And the custom became that in each of these chapels there would be a relic. Right? And so pilgrims who would come, whether or not there was something going on behind the rood screen, like Mass or the office, the pilgrims would circumnavigate the church and visit these shrines. The thing that was really kind of interesting is all these churches were in a sense each trying to get a relic of a saint that would make their church more famous than the neighboring church, right? And if people gave donations, then the reliquary or the vessel that held that relic became fabulously encrusted with jewels or gold. And people would literally go from place to place just to see these images of the relics of the saints. This is one such reliquary. It is the reliquary of Saint Foy. Saint Foy was a 12-year-old girl who was martyred during the time of the Romans. And the actual relic contained in this sculpture is the skull, which is in the head of this piece. Over time, people would come and they would pray in front of this image, and if their prayer was granted, for example, somebody might say, I would pray that my wife has a child. So if their prayer was granted, they would leave some kind of jewel or something, and that would eventually be placed on the reliquary. So that's St. Flora. Now, little interesting side, when Hitler invaded France, he wanted this statue in the worst way, because it is covered with jewels. The people of the town took this reliquary out of the church and they hid it in their homes. And they kept passing it from home to home, and as the Germans would get close to one place, they'd put it in a hay wagon or something and take it down the street to another house. He never did find it. So it's a testament to the faith of these local people that they never let go of their patron saint. Some of the other work that would be done in monasteries, of course, was the copying and illumination of books, which even today are fabulously beautiful. Sometimes 2 or 3 people would spend a number of years copying one book. Mind you, this is all before electric light and heat. So the scriptorium, the place where books were copied, was always above the one room in the monastery that had a fireplace. So it would keep the people who were the copyists a little bit warmer. And that room always had big windows so they could use the light. Last little bit of monastic culture we're going to look at. This is a German monastery called St. Michael in Hildesheim. And the ceiling of their church is a painted wooden ceiling of the Jesse tree, which we talked about the previous time. It is the entire length of the church, and it is painted on slabs of wood, and this has never been retouched, and it's never, the only way it survived was during both World Wars. They took the entire ceiling down and hid it in a cave. So this is at the bottom of the window, it's Adam and Eve. As I said, people became very interested in pilgrimage, and what you're looking at is a map of France and Spain. Have any of you ever gone on the way? There's a pilgrimage, the most famous pilgrimage site in Europe is to a place called Compostela, and it's supposed to have the relics of St. James the Apostle. Right? So by the Middle Ages, there were all of these different roads. It was like a network of roads, and all of them kind of trickled down across the Pyrenees and then joined up into one road that went across northern Spain to the west and ended up at Compostela. So pilgrimage was used for several things. Pilgrimage was a way to sentence a criminal and get them out of your town. So, for example, if you killed somebody in the town, you would be sentenced to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which in most cases meant you would never be back, because very few people actually got to Jerusalem and came back. Sometimes people went on devotional pilgrimages if they were closer to home, and those pilgrimages were used to ask a favor of a saint or a cure, perhaps. And then by the time of Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, you see that people are going on these pilgrimages almost like a holiday. So all of the people that the Canterbury Tales are talking about are actually going to the tomb of Thomas Becket, one of the very famous, probably the most famous English saints in Canterbury. So churches acquired these significant relics. The ambulatory became a necessary feature in order to let people move through the church without interrupting the services. The liturgy continued in the choir while the pilgrims moved around the edges. And lots of popular sites. Rome was certainly very important. Compostela, Tours, Vézelay, Caen, Autun, and Cologne. This would be an example of one of those reliquaries, like a little less grandiose than St. Foy. Very often, the reliquaries took the form of either half or whole body. And the relics, the bones or the skull or something would be enclosed within these reliquaries. I'll tell you an interesting story about this one. This is in a church called Saint Nectaire, and it's way up in the mountains in the south side of France. So I was traveling when I had about 6 months off, and I was traveling around France, seeing all these historic churches, and I got to Saint Nectaire, and at the entrance to the town, there's usually a sign that has a circle around it, and it says Saint Nectaire in the middle. And when you get to the other end of the town, meaning you're leaving Saint Nectaire, there's a circle with the name and it has a slash through it. So I drive into Saint Nectaire. About a minute later, I'm driving out of Saint Nectaire and I never saw the church. And so I went back in and I saw somebody walking and I went, Abbé de Saint Nectaire? And they went. So I looked up and there was this very steep kind of mountain that was stuck right in the middle of the town, and it had a one-way, one-lane road winding around. So I started driving up, and I thought, I wonder what happens if I need a truck or a car coming down. And sure enough, I did. But we squeaked by each other, and I was on the outside, and there was no rail. Anyway, I get up, it's about 7 o'clock in the morning. So I get up to the church, and on the door of the church, there's a sign that says, in French, and it says, if you're looking for the reliquary or the treasury of Saint Nectaire, it's to the left of the sanctuary. So I go in, I go to the left of the sanctuary. Here is this huge oaken chest that's covered with these big iron bars. And you take I don't know what the smaller denominations of euro coins are, but it's like you take 25 cents and you put it in the slot, and then the window lights up and it lets you see the treasures, So I go in and I get the coin and I put it in, and there in the spot where Saint Nectaire is supposed to be, there's a little sign that says, the reliquary of Saint Nectaire is on loan to the Museum of Cleveland, Ohio. So, all of these Romanesque churches, and this is about where we're going to stop today, you would have wall paintings, right? Because the walls were very thick and the windows were very small, so these churches were usually decorated with fresco paintings. This was taken out of a Spanish church in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. But something happened right around, like, anywhere from around 1120 to maybe 1220. There was a quantum leap in the engineering capabilities in Europe. And that was, I think we made reference to the flying buttons. So suddenly, walls that had been extremely thick and windows that had been very tiny, all of these churches would have been lit only with candles. So they'd be very dark and mysterious looking. Suddenly now, through the use of these flying buttresses on the outside of the building, these walls, which were opaque and dark, turn into this. Entire walls in churches disappeared and became windows of glass, of colored glass. So we're going to stop here, take a break, and then we'll have questions from you guys, if you have questions. And next time, we'll go from this period, the Gothic period, up to present day, and then Michael will have the last half of the next session on the north. He will show you the floor plan of the renovated church. Okay? Have a cookie.